right. Hey, there's me sitting there. All right, how you doing? So welcome to our panel on prototypes, consoles, and history and all that. And so that's me on the screen, and I'm right here. My name is Adam Koralik. We'll do a little bit of a round of introduction, and then we'll just start talking about stuff. So go ahead.
You didn't introduce yourself.
I just said it. My name's Adam Koralik.
What's your job?
I'm a YouTuber. Look at the screen, dude. It's behind you.
I can't
I know
see it.
it
It's
should be up there.
Omnimax.
This is, by the way, I shot this in 70 millimeter, like Oppenheimer. The theater's just not compatible. No. Go ahead.
My name is Rob Janos. I'm the co-host of Adam's podcast that nobody listens to called the Figure It Out Cast.
That's a great way to sell it.
And I'm a video game historian. I teach classes on video game history. I've done work with the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas, and I work with Digital Press Video Games, the best video game store ever.
Ready? Hey, I'm Sunshine. I'm in Adam Koralik's Discord server. I just kind of showed up. I have a couple of development consoles, so hey, I'm here.
He's very good at just showing up. I appreciate that.
I've actually never met this man before in my entire life.
And now they hang out. So yeah, what we're mostly going to do is just talk about some obviously prototype consoles. Now, the reason we've chosen this in the background is that's the Nintendo PlayStation prototype. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that story. But it was like history's most infamous story, as you can see these random clips that I was showing at one point. Sony and Nintendo were getting together and they were going to make a console known as the PlayStation. Eventually, the whole thing buckles under corporate pressure, and all that really came of it, at least for history's purposes, is the thing I'm holding in that footage, which was ultimately a Super Famicom with a proprietary disc drive, kind of like the Sega CD. It's called the Super Disc. Now, the guy who owned it, his name is Terry Diebold, and if you watch this whole video, you can get the whole story on it. A few years ago, after this video, he ends up selling it for $334,000. And then he himself passed away only like 6 months later. And this prototype is now sitting in a vault in Los Angeles by the owner is Greg McLemore, who is the guy who created Pets.com. And we are hoping he'll let us have access to it at some point. But I got to make this video like the night before Terry sold the thing. So this was like potentially the most comprehensive video on it. But it kind of really got me into like prototypes and exploring them and talking about them. So did you guys ever see the Nintendo PlayStation when it was around? I know it came to this con at some point, right?
I came to AVGC. That's where I
know it was there.
Yeah.
Joe, was it ever here? Did you guys ever have the Nintendo PlayStation? No, you don't remember that? Okay. Yeah, so it's a cool device, as you can see. It's just an interesting piece of what-if type of history. And we discovered all sorts of weird stuff about it, like that if you were playing a Super Nintendo game in it, with its disc drive, if you put like a music CD in there, it would override the audio and give you, the music CD. So we were thinking it was possible they might have had the intelligence to be like, oh, we can firmware update Super Nintendo games back in the day with like compatible music CDs, so you would have had music quality audio with say like, I don't know.
Link to the Past.
Yeah, any game that Nintendo would have done. It's hard to say what the potential actually was. But yeah, it was just cool to be able to actually explore it. And, to this day, my understanding, I'm still the last person that ever played it, which I'll show footage of in this video later. But yeah, so
the interesting thing about the PlayStation is that the disc drive, unlike kind of a Sega CD, is criminally underpowered.
Yeah.
It's the Sega CD, like if you know your video game history, was kind of introduced by Sega to bridge the gap between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and maybe do a little bit more than their competition. This was kind of done in response to that, and the TurboGrafx CD and the rise of other CD game consoles, but it is vastly underpowered.
Yeah. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Ben Heck, or you know him by name. So he had more intimate access to this than anybody else because he actually got to take it apart. And I did a video with him a few years ago with the Sega Pluto, which we'll talk about in a bit. And he basically told me his theory was, yeah, I think if you ask me, the reason Nintendo and Sony didn't get along is because Sony designed the disc drive, and it was actually inferior to the cartridge slot. It was actually, everything ran slower, it ran worse. He's like, I don't see any reason Nintendo would want to use this, but then was just kind of locked into it. He's like, that was his idea as to why it eventually failed. But having access to it, though, it was a really cool machine to be able to actually see and use.
Because it was legendary.
It was a unicorn. It wasn't supposed to really exist, and then Terry found it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the interesting thing about the PlayStation as well as the Pluto is that, as gamers, as game collectors, as many of us are, That's kind of the dream, is going to a garage sale or, going to a thrift store and finding a piece of video game history that is legendary, that you've never seen before, that is priceless in the eyes of gaming historians and things like that. And with both the Nintendo PlayStation as well as the Sega Pluto, that's how they were found.
Yeah,
they were found in the wild.
Yeah, so Terry, in this video, Terry will speak for himself, but I'll kind of truncate it. Basically, what happened is he was just a kind of a jack of all trades type of dude, and he was given a gig. That's Terry right there, the late Terry Diebold. He had been given a random gig to go around to parts of, I think it was in Pennsylvania actually, to estate sales. And hey, we're just going to pay you like $50 for the day. Come in and pack up a whole bunch of boxes for all these estates that are closing up, and then we'll take those boxes, put them up on an auction block, and whoever bids, they get all this stuff. Kind of Storage Wars logic. And so he packed up this box for this guy named Olaf Olafsson, who was the first president of PlayStation ever. And all the boxes that he was interested in, he was packing up like saucers, plates, cups, forks, knives. That's like houseware stuff. And he's like, that's what I want. So he looks at this box. He knows he packed it. He's like, I bid $75 for that box. That's all he cared about. Then there was a whole bunch of unsold boxes, and he ends up with all of them. Doesn't care about anything in there. He's like, there was a bunch of random ties and music CDs. I didn't care about any of that. They eventually find that in the bottom of the box. So Olaf Olafsson had been told by Sony, destroy this, destroy all of them. He didn't. He kept it on his desk for years. And it ends up in Terry's hands from a legal perspective, just because he bought this lot of boxes. And he kept it in his attic because he couldn't find any information on it, because naturally there really wasn't any, because you weren't supposed to know it existed. And eventually, years later, he told me at ABGC, actually, he's like, when we first kind of noticed this thing might be important, we were trying to dig around information on what was a Nintendo PlayStation. I had done a video on it years earlier, just from the stock photos we had. He's like, yeah, your video was one of the ones that taught us what it was. And then we started, making more content on it, and then the whole internet lost its mind. So he ended up touring with this thing for multiple years, letting the world see it. And so I learned a lot from him about, what you do with that kind of thing, and just which kind of games people want to check out. He said never let people play RPGs at a con, because they'll just sit down and never go away. So you use fighting games, you use racing games, stuff people can kind of pick up and play in a bit. But ultimately, I didn't realize I would fall into a very similar position as him, which is just, hey, I'm going to have access to weird machines. Let me travel around with them. Yeah, do you have anything else to say on that?
Actually, I think you mentioned it in this video, but did he ever try and see what Sony's stance was, if they wanted this thing back?
He approached, Nintendo straight up ignored him. They would not talk to him. Shuhei Yoshida himself reached out to him, and he basically told him, like, that's really cool, hold on to that. He's like, Sony was actually cool about it, because we have to remember, Sony actually built this machine. Nintendo did not. It was just Nintendo had technically signed off on it. But yeah, Sony's official position on it was cool. So one of the things they did, you've probably seen a little bit of the footage here and there. There was a special white cartridge that came with it and all this. It was bootloading software for the Super Disc, which is that basically CD-ROM part at the bottom. They dumped that online, so anybody actually has access to the source code. They could develop games for it if they really wanted to. Only one game was ever developed for it, which we briefly showed earlier. It's a game called Super Boss Gaiden, which any one of you can download and play on a Super Nintendo. The premise of it is the president of Sony finds out that their prototype has been stolen, and he goes around beating up all his employees to find out who leaked it. That's the premise of the game. And so, yeah, that was really the only game we know materialized. I know there were other games, like legit ones in development. There was supposed to be a version of Secret of Mana that was actually completed for that version, but it's never seen the light of day at anybody's knowledge. There was a few, we think the idea was Super Nintendo games on CD with better music was probably all it really would have been. It's more so the history of it and the fact that the PlayStation as we know it as a brand was born out of this. Nintendo's strange deviation to the N64 and their isolation from third-party developers and all that was born of this project. And to think it wasn't just this myth. This happened. You can see me there with it. This happened in reality. And so I've kind of grown an affinity for these, what-if prototype stories. So we got a few things out here that we thought we'd kind of talk about. Before we switch to that, though, did you ever see the Nintendo PlayStation?
No, I never went to cons back then.
That was a mistake. You should go to Long Island Retro more often.
I'll try to
Yeah,
from
there's
now
this
on.
really cool con.
This is like one of the best run cons I've ever been to, by the way, Joe. Everybody give this man a round of applause, because this show would not happen without him. Yep. But yeah, so what would you like to pivot to here? What do you want to talk about? Because we got a whole bunch of weird stuff. Why don't we start on that end?
Yeah,
That way you can tell us
Speaking of
something.
Nintendo and PlayStation,
Yes.
here's a couple of dev kits from Nintendo and
Lean into
PlayStation.
the mic more.
Sorry. Yeah, here's a couple of dev kits from Nintendo and PlayStation. We have no idea why they used the same teal color between the two companies.
It's funny.
It's an odd coincidence.
And they're different generations.
Exactly.
So, like, yeah, what else can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so we got the NR reader here, which does, because it's Nintendo, only plays proprietary disc. Basically, the PS1 debugging kit, which you have here, it's not a Net Eurose, which is what most people are familiar with, that had a retail release. It's only dev kit hardware. But basically, it is just a region-free PlayStation, so it's useful as a daily driver.
And where did you get it?
I found them in West Virginia, of all places, a local Facebook Marketplace listing.
Don't sleep on finding stuff in the wild.
Yeah,
I'm telling
you find
Exactly.
bizarre things. So do you want? Should we talk about that?
Oh, the one thing that he did fail to mention is that while this is a region-free PlayStation as well, the NR reader is region-free. Do you want to show them the switch on the side?
Yeah, so there is a switch on the side, but it is only NTSC, so it will not play PAL games, so USA or Japan only.
And yeah, it will not play retail discs, like it because the GameCube I think has a barcode reader in the disc drive basically. So it's like it recognizes a game and then it'll play it. This will not play retail discs, but it will play burn games.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but as my understanding of this, because I only first saw this thing yesterday, its purpose was so that when they were making games, there was a bit of security around it, so you couldn't just launch like unreleased games on normal hardware. You had to have the special hardware with the special disc.
Exactly, and it's only the laser that's special about this GameCube, so if you swap the laser on it, it brings it back to a full retail GameCube.
Yeah, so I know that Sega did something similar with the Dreamcast. So like when they were shipping out these things called GDRs, they were basically prototype versions of stuff. You've probably seen maybe them online. Those will not run on a standard Dreamcast unless you have something called a System Disc 2, which is the type of disc that boots that. And it's still to this day the only disc you can't really replicate on a Dreamcast. It's very bizarre. But I guess they just went the extra step and built an entire console version of that concept, which is kind of interesting. So good on you for finding those, and thank him for bringing those, because I just randomly text him like, "Yo, can you bring that stuff?" All right, let's do it. So let's talk about that.
So this is an interesting piece of
This
video.
is a great one.
Yeah. This is not a game system, but yeah.
You talk, I'll hold.
Yeah. This is not a game system, although some people would say, yes, it is. What
Does
game?
anybody recognize this?
Yeah. What is that? Yeah, it's an Atari Jaguar, right?
That's what everybody says.
So Atari Jaguar is infamously, it's not as bad as people think, but infamously is Atari's last console that they made in the 90s. And it was a 64-bit console. The play cartridges, it did have a CD add-on called the Jaguar CD, and it was a colossal failure, like most of Atari's stuff. So when Atari discontinued making the Jaguar, they were selling off everything that basically wasn't bolted down. Office furniture, designs, IPs, you name it, they were trying to liquidate it all. One of the things that they were trying to liquidate and ended up doing successfully was the mold for an Atari Jaguar console. It's a very iconic shape. It kind of looks like something out of Star Trek or something. It's kind of cool.
It looks almost like a hot rod.
It looks.
That'll make more sense in a minute.
Yeah, it looks it's a cool looking thing. So, and it's recognizable enough that even though this is not an Atari Jaguar, you guys recognized it. You all said it was. So this was sold, the rights to the mold and the image of this console was sold to a company called Imogen. And where are they based out of?
Imogen is based in San Francisco, California. So Imogen goes ahead. The guy, Steve, who I eventually got to do an interview with, really cool guy, he basically just designs dental equipment. And the way he told me the story, he's like, Yeah, like we have to do cameras. Like, you ever went to a dentist's office and like you look on the wall, there's some sort of computer rig, and then there's like a cable that goes down into your mouth
And
to
they
do
stick
X-rays.
this big thing right
Yeah.
in your mouth. Yeah.
That's what this is. So that's what he built, because that's what his company to this day still builds. So the reason he chose this design is he was like, well, I could spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in R&D to make a new shape. Oh wait, this is a defunct video game company that I can buy the lot for $1,400 and be done with it. I'll do that. And so that's what he ends up doing. So I did an interview with him where he's telling me the whole story, and he's like looking at the original Atari receipts. He's like, you gotta understand, dude, it's been 20 years and no one's ever asked me about this. And I was like, nobody ever cared? He's like, no, nobody ever cared. But so he's looking at it, he's like, oh, I bought the molds for the system. Oh, look, I bought the cartridges. And I was like, for what? He's like, I think we were thinking extra RAM, because there's a cartridge slot on it. So everybody asked me, does it play games? No, it's RAM upgrades. And then he was like, oh, look, I bought the CD molds. I'm like, what? Where are those? And he's like, I don't know, dude. But he did remember that he didn't buy the controllers specifically. So what ends up happening is he's confident in the design. This is going to be, I mean, obviously, I don't know how anybody in here is into the dental industry at all, but it was going to be the next big thing with dental equipment. And the idea was, believe it or not, this would have retailed to dentists for $20,000 because that kind of stuff is expensive. It's X-ray technology. So what he was like, well, I'm going to try and encourage people to do this because he built wall mounts, he built all this other stuff, and the idea was this handle exists for a reason. You take it around the office and just like lock it into mounts. That way, the dentist himself only has to buy one instead of buying multiples. And the mistake he made is that on the bottom, it uses SCSI interface technology, which is like 1980s tech, but he was trying to sell this in 2004. So everybody's like, I can't use this. I need USB. Hey, there it is on screen. There you go. Perfect. That's it. You can see the big port there on the back. And he was trying to sell it to that, and nobody wanted to buy it. So he's like, yeah, we mass-produced the shells by like 10,000 units. If you ever look around on eBay or wherever and you see like random white Jaguar shells, those are Steve's. And he was hawking them on eBay because he's like,
They were like $25
he was
for
like, and they were all shipped directly from Image. And he was like, whoever wants them, I gotta get them out of here. I can't use them. But the actual board, the guts of it, he made 4. And they were all sitting in his office. Years later, I made a buddy of mine now who's named Jesse. The first time I ever met Jesse, he's like, you remember that whole thing about the dental equipment? I was like, yeah. He's like, we're going over there right now. He drives me to the office. He's like, I got a job over there. They have them. I'm like, what? And that's when we just do the interview, the first time I've ever met this guy. And he turns out, Jesse, when he's like, wow, I'm so excited, the boss is like, oh yeah, here, just take one. I don't care. They're junk in the office. So my buddy Jesse loaned it to me so that we can all see it. But this, if you're old enough, you might remember this as like a meme. The idea that, you remember that story about how Atari got turned into, like there's these old photos like that are really blurry and out of focus. The meme is real, ladies and gentlemen. This really happened. And it was called the Hot Rod. And so, but it says it on the back, demo unit, not for sale, Hot Rod Dental Manager. You got to understand, when I even asked Steve, like, was like Atari a big company you like? He's like, I'd heard of them before. Like, he didn't, that's just not his universe, but he is technically involved with this random piece of video game history. If we can pull up another video, we have this video on the Sega Neptune. You got that?
Yeah. Okay.
So we'll talk all about that in a second when he finds it. Yeah. So I've obviously, as you can see, I've got a whole lot of videos on a bunch of random stuff like this. I don't know. Is it the one where we did the prototype reunion? Yeah, that's it. Put that on in the background. So this is a good time to transition into this, I think. So the other thing we have sitting here is the Sega Pluto prototype. Anybody ever hear of this? Sega Pluto. Okay. You know what? I've been doing a lot of talking. You talk about it.
So the Sega Pluto is effectively, it's a Sega Saturn. Sega at the time in the 90s used a naming convention for all of their systems as well as their prototypes when the systems were in development, and it was all celestial bodies in the solar system.
Appropriate for that guy, Sunshine over there. Yeah. You guys remember, that's his name, Sunshine.
He's the Sega Sunshine. He's not for sale.
Yeah. So about that, like actually a lot of Sega consoles all have planetary names. Like the Game Gear is the Mercury.
Yeah.
The Venus was actually something that Sega themselves only revealed to us all a couple of years ago during the pandemic. You can look this up. Sega Venus is the early version of the Nomad. And there's only one to exist, and it's in Sega's office, which, by the way, is how we found out they themselves do not have a Sega Pluto. Sega Earth is actually Sega CD, so if you ever turn on the Sega CD and see that bias screen with the Earth in the background, ladies and gentlemen, that's why it's called that. The Mars is actually the 32X. Take apart a 32X, it says Mars right on the board. Jupiter was an alternative 32-bit 5th-gen cartridge-based system they never released. So in addition to the 32X and the Saturn, there could have been a thing called the Jupiter. So that didn't happen. The Saturn is obvious.
The Saturn.
The Neptune is what we end up talking about here.
It's right there.
Right there in the center, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Uranus was skipped for pretty obvious reasons. And the Sega Pluto is right here in front of us.
Yes.
Yeah, so this video is mostly about the Neptune. So what ends up happening, which one do you want to talk about first?
Well, let's take off the Pluto
Maybe let's
first.
talk about the Neptune because it's actually on screen.
So, a couple years ago, as I mentioned when I introduced myself, I've done work with the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas. Joe Santulli, who also owns Digital Press Video Games, is one of the founders of this museum. And we went down once Adam had possession of the Sega Pluto.
Which, again, we'll talk more about in a bit.
And we wanted to bring it down there because we're like, oh, they have a Sega Neptune. And the Sega Neptune, for all intents and purposes, was a consoleized 32X. This was about the same size as a Genesis Model 2 system.
I think it's pretty much exactly the same size.
Yeah. But with its cartridge port, in addition to playing Sega Genesis games, of course, plays 32X games. And this was never released because the 32X was a massive failure and bombed probably within, 2 years or so?
It's shaped like a nuclear explosion over the Genesis for a reason.
So they have this down there. And I approach my boss and say, hey, we want to go visit the video game museum and bring the Sega Pluto, and we'll do a little Sega family reunion of prototype consoles. Interestingly enough, I had no idea. You had no idea. They said, oh, you don't need to do that. We already have a Pluto here.
And we were like, what? Because there was only two Plutos ever made.
So what's this third one? So the third one is the white console that you see on the screen. And that is just a mock-up.
Yeah, it's just like really heavy. It's just molding. It doesn't do anything.
Yeah, so that is a non-functioning Sega Pluto. And when we told my boss Joe, I said, no, ours actually works. And he's like, oh, yeah, totally.
Go down there. Yeah.
Go down there. So we end up having this, by the way, I don't want to pimp out his channel because
you should, though.
I'm not a filthy shill.
But
but this is the most criminally underviewed video on his entire channel.
I am the only person who has ever had intimate access to the Neptune on YouTube history. Nobody watches it. I'm like, it's right, dude. It's the only one in existence. I'm right. I'm the only person who's ever held it and made a video about it.
By the way, this also is a non-functioning console.
Yeah.
This was something to be photographed and sent out to video game magazines.
Yes.
It's like, look at this cool thing that's coming out.
As far as we know, Sega never made an operational version of the Neptune.
Yeah. So this is, it was very, very cool to kind of have hands-on access. I say hands-on access. I'm the one filming this, but I did not have hands-on access.
I did.
So, it was very cool. It's a little Sega reunion, and to think that, all three of these things were probably in the same room for the first time in
possibly
ever at least 30 years. So, the Neptune is, it's an interesting thing to kind of get into just because it is a failed console. The Saturn is not a failed console. Well, here it was, but not worldwide.
But the interesting thing is, you can see me kind of just pointing at and looking at random stuff. Right there, what I'm showing is the Sega CD slot that would have existed on it. Until then, it was unknown if the thing even had one.
We've never seen pictures of the bottom of it.
Because there's only the one, and the museum never really took those kind of photos. So it's this video teaches you all the stuff we never knew about the Neptune.
Yeah.
And so it was really cool. I mean, to the museum's credit, they were really on board with it. But where that kind of the genesis of that, where that started, was that when I wanted to do this, I was like, I want to go down there and do a video on the Neptune. And you're like, no museum is going to let you just take stuff from behind the glass and just do whatever you want.
And they're like, here you go.
Yeah, well, that happened because I had the idea. I'm like, my buddy owns the Pluto. What if we brought it down there and did this weird prototype reunion? I just didn't think it would work, but it totally did. So to the museum's credit, if you're ever in Frisco, Texas, which is just a little bit north of Dallas, go to the National Video Game Museum.
Incredible museum.
It's absolutely great. So now I guess it would be time to talk about the Pluto since we've got it right here in front of us. So Where do we even start with it? Like our story, its story.
So
what's the story?
you want to tell the story of how your buddy?
Yeah, let's do the whole. Let's just do the whole thing. So the Sega Pluto prototype sitting here in front of me. There are only 2 functional units ever built. We know that firsthand from people at Sega because I had a pre-existing relationship working with Sega because I helped to bring the Shenmue franchise back and all this other stuff. And so they were very willing to talk to me about all this. And they were like, yeah. So the deal was we made 6. But 4 of them are those white ones you see there. We destroyed 3 of those. One of them, one of the employees took, and that guy reached out to us. He's like, yeah, I took that and I donated it to the museum. That's how they have it. So he's like, the other 2, one ended up in their office in California as an almost final version. Then a final edition of it was shipped to Japan for Sega of Japan to approve. They canceled the project. It just kind of went away. We were never really meant to know about it. But ultimately, the Japanese one shows up in 2013 in an estate sale because the guy who at Sega of Japan who possessed it died. And somebody cleaning out his house is like, what is this? He went to the internet. Nobody had ever seen it before. Everybody's freaking out. Sega had been making another console that nobody ever heard of. And my buddy Roger, who owns this one, goes to the internet. He's like, I have one. And everybody's like, no, you don't. Look, I'm holding them like newborns. Like it's... But he's like, yeah, no, you don't. He freaks, the internet freaks out. He's like, I'm willing to sell it. It means nothing to me. And then the internet's sending him death threats because you're not allowed to own rare things, apparently. So he was just like, yeah, my life was pretty drama-free before this. I'm putting this back in a shoebox. So years later, I eventually met him, and I was like, dude, you have no idea what you're sitting on. Like, this is the craziest, rarest thing. So he's like, and then I asked him.
By the way, look at this beautiful individual next to you in this video.
Yeah, I'm right here, yeah.
Look at that. Look at that.
The homeless guy?
Yeah, the homeless guy.
To be fair, they both look pretty homeless. Anyway, but basically to backtrack a little on how did Roger, of all people, this guy named Roger who owns this, how did he end up with it? So when he was a kid, he went to a flea market in Ceres, California in 1999, and he just saw this like, the way he describes it is like, what we now know is clearly a former Sega employee was just lifting stuff out of the office and just hawking it for nothing. And he's like, I saw it in a pile of like CD players. And I just thought, oh, I saw the Saturn logo and thought, this is pre-Google, pre-smartphone. And he just goes, that must be what a Japanese Saturn looks like. I'll just buy it. How much is it? The guy's like, $5. And he's like, I have 3. That's fine. And so he buys it for $3 as a child. No idea what he just ended up with. Now, at the time, it had a couple of oddities. The disk drive, you can look up old photos when Roger had this. The disk drive was always open like this, which we'll get back to. But other than that, it was fine. But he was like, oh, that's what a Japanese system. He would put Japanese games in it. None of them booted. Oh, it's broken. Throws it in his shoebox. Doesn't care about it. Puts it in his closet. Forgets about it for 2 decades. Eventually, I'm at a store in Campbell, California called, I think it's the Retrofix. And the guy named Rudy who runs it, he's like, hey, Adam, you ever heard of the Sega Pluto? I'm like, yeah, of course I have. I know, why? I was shocked. And he's like, yeah, the guy who owns it's like 10 minutes from here. You want to see it? And I was like, yeah. And so he calls 10 minutes later. Roger shows up. Yeah, here you go. Doesn't care about this thing whatsoever. And he's like, it's broken. It doesn't do anything. I'm like, how do you know it's broken? Have you ever tried it? And he's like, yeah, it's Japanese. I put Japanese games. I'm like, dude, it's American. And he's like, oh. You sure? I'm like, yes. So we grab an American game. It immediately works. He freaks out. We did a video on it, actually, at the time. Yeah. So ultimately, Roger and I are like, I convince him, like, you gotta do stuff with this. This thing is special. You can't just let this sit in a shoebox, man. So I convince him to join with me and go out to meet up with Ben Heck, who lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Ben Heck takes the thing apart because he's obviously the dude who worked on the Nintendo PlayStation. He could be trusted with it. What Ben ultimately does is the only problem we could find from a hardware perspective was the first controller port didn't work. But he was able to, he's like, that's a quick fix. Like, that happens with standard Saturns. It's not that big of a deal. So he fixes that. He recaps everything. And then there was the disk drive, how it was always up. Now, this is particularly strange. There is a little white latch piece in there that holds the disk. This is very standard for, like, any sort of disk drive. Yet, for whatever reason, Sega never put that part in it. It was just, it always stayed up because there was just no, so Ben's like, I can 3D print something, I guess. And so he did, and there you go. It's been sitting there working ever since. So I had made my videos. I was kind of done with it. But then, of course, this whole thing with the Neptune comes up. And I asked Roger, like, I know this is bizarre. Can I fly out to California, take your retirement plan, and go away with it? And he was just like, okay. So he just let me borrow it, and I've had it ever since. I always message him, and I'm like, hey, man, do you want it back? Do you need it? You know, and he's like, no, what's he going to do? I'm going to sit here in a shoebox. I'm not doing anything with it. So I take it to cons. Anybody wants to see it. It's just really rare piece of history.
But by the way, anybody wants to play it.
Yeah, we had it set up out there.
It's
You can
set.
play it.
It's set up where we're next
but-
to John Riggs and Pat Contry.
Yeah.
Come play it.
Yeah. So, but one of the cool things is, so the Japanese guy, because that's the other piece of the story. The guy who founded his in 2013, after we started making videos about it, he reaches out to us. He's like, we should maybe know each other because there's only 2 of these things and we're the owners. And we're like, yeah, but then the conversation didn't go much further until like a couple months later. He's like, actually, you know what? Thank you for making all those videos. I'm going to sell mine now. And we were like, oh, happy to help, I guess. And we're like, how much are you trying to sell it for? And he was like, I'm hoping for like $3,000 US. And we were like, good luck, because the thing was, since we had so much experience with the Nintendo PlayStation, that thing had sold undervalued, we think, at like 334. We're like, and this thing is nowhere near as famous, because every time we talk about the Pluto, like he just said, criminally underviewed videos, and it's just like, I don't think people care as much about it, so I don't think you're going to get 3,000. Heritage Auctions gets him $84,000. And then they talk to us later, and they're basically like, oh, you have the other one? You probably get them like 150K. And I told Roger, and he's like, hold out for more. And I was like, okay. So it's unrealistic in my opinion. But point is, that guy sold it. And so now I don't know where the other one ended up. We do know that it ended up in somebody who's super private's hands. We don't know who actually possesses it. But that would make this one the only one that is publicly viewable, other than the white one, which, again, doesn't do anything. So yeah, enjoy it at cons, enjoy it while you can, enjoy it while you see it, and we take it on tour. It's been to a lot of weird places too.
It's been to Guam.
It's been to Guam twice. So I travel a lot for unrelated reasons, sometimes related to cons and sometimes not. And I tend to take it with me just because I don't know why I'm doing this exactly, but I'll like take it and I'll take photos of it in front of weird stuff, like famous. Like it's been to the Goonies house. It's been to be local. It's been to the Empire State Building, but I mean, okay, we're just talking Oppenheimer for a second. Your World War II history. Those bombs, they end up going to a small island in the Pacific called Tinian, where the Enola Gay took off. Where the bomb pits are is like they have a little American museum there because it's part of the United States. They kept the bomb pit. They have a whole history. It's been to both bomb pits. I took it there. And so it's been around the world to a lot of random places. And so I think it's Justin Silverman. I don't know if he's here at the moment. I know he was here earlier. He suggested that we do like a coffee table book out of the weird places that Pluto's been. It's kind of like an elf in the shelf logic thing. But I don't know exactly what the plan is. There's no plan. But easily the most well-traveled console in history, I would imagine.
So at this point, I'm sure you're actually wondering, so what's so special about this thing? It's just a differently shaped Saturn.
Yes. I guess we should have said what it is.
So it plays Saturn games. I mean, that's pretty cool. Not too many things that do that.
Oh yeah, no. But there's that other one big thing.
So the big thing that distinguishes this apart visually from a normal stock Saturn is what it was designed to do.
Yeah.
The Pluto was designed as a revision to the Saturn that was going to be online capable. It was going to have a router.
Yeah, there's a whole lot to this. So
Yeah.
basically the history of it, because we've been putting it together, bits and pieces from former employees who are willing to talk to us. The Americans don't have anything that nice to say. The Japanese really don't have anything nice to say. And basically what the plan was, and we got this big, I don't know if anybody out there paid attention to like a couple months ago, there was a big Sega leak email thing that happened.
Amazing.
The Pluto had a ton of info in there. We were like, oh great, this is
They're
an
like
amazing resource.
internet service providers.
Right. So
and,
the basic idea was Sega of America redesigned this, saying the Saturn, the way the Japanese want us to do it in North America, is not going to work. Let's bet on the internet as the future. Hey, Sega was right about that. And so they were like, we put a built-in modem in it. They put a built-in hard drive. I am holding the first hard drive in any video game console in human history.
About 5 years before the original.
5 years before the Xbox came out. This is the first one. And yes, we tried to dump it. It's completely blank. Yeah, I know. Disappointing as to us, too. But the idea was that Sega of America had the power to force Sega of Japan to physically construct this, and Sega of Japan had the power to deny Sega of America from being able to release it. The thing is essentially born as like a hate between the two companies caught in red tape, which is why they only made the two. Now, we learned very recently that it would have cost $550 retail in 1997. Yes, that would have...
Good luck selling that.
Yeah, absolutely would have killed it. But we also learned, because we had suspected this, but we now know it to be true, they were going for Xbox Game Pass for the Sega Saturn in 1996. 96, because we have a timestamp on it. January of 96 is this. That's what this actually says. Is we fixed the modem. January of 96. So they were actually probably starting as early as 95.
So, Sega was at that time, if you kind of know the history of the Genesis and the Saturn, they were dipping their toe into the idea of streaming games through a cable connection or through, what was that, Sega Channel, was that called?
Yeah, we think that they never officially called it Sega Channel to our understanding, but that's basically what we think. They were just expanding it to the next generation, Sega Channel, because we did dive enough into the hard drive to know 520 megabytes, which of course now, nothing. But in 1996, that's what PCs had. And the size of that drive was good enough for any one Saturn disk at a time. So the idea would be download a game, pay for the service. You don't have to actually buy the games. You can just have them. Again, Game Pass 30 years ago. That's amazing. Question? So we kind of, not in that leak, but what we kind of got from a different Japanese guy, because somebody asked us on our behalf, because I've been doing this, and I forget, I think it was like Sega Powered Magazine, like a British publication. Somebody did this. They actually had one of the devs for this, Japanese guy, and they asked him, like, what happened with that? He had nothing nice to say. He had a lot of, a lot of expletives, and he was like, that thing was this and this, and like, he had nothing, and ultimately it was, the real reason, it would have cost too much. And the Japanese really did not believe the internet was the future. And if you actually go there, you can still.
It's still kind
they
of
still
like
kind of think that. The internet is still kind of considered. I mean, everybody thinks of Japan as this technological powerhouse. They still read their newspapers. They don't.
Fax machines.
Yeah, fax machines
still
or dot matrix fax machines are still very much a thing there. So like the internet is the future in '96 from a Japanese perspective. No, that's wrong. So yeah, we're pretty sure all that killed it was Sega of Japan did not like Sega of America coming up with ideas. I mean, there's a whole history between those two companies, those divisions hating each other. Yeah. Like, the Japanese genuinely hated that this Genesis was successful here because the Mega Drive was a complete flop in Japan, and the Japanese had to just ride it out because it was so successful in the rest of the world. For them, it was like an embarrassment thing. So to be one-upped by the Americans again, they'd rather just ruin the company than actually see it come through.
That was really the possible genesis of the 32X. Yeah. Was like, no, you're not ready for the Saturn. You get the 32X. You get a Genesis tumor.
Yeah, and the 32, to be fair to the 32X, if they hadn't released a Saturn here, it actually could have worked because it was backwards compatible with the Genesis, which was stupid popular, and now rather than buy a $300 system, you can buy a $150 console and upgrade to the next generation. It made sense on paper, but you can't do both. You have to do one or the other. Yeah. So it's like a whole long, complicated thing, but basically what we do know about this was the Japanese just would not allow the Americans to release it. Mostly they claim due to price. I would assume there's a little bit of angst as well.
Gamesmanship,
So we can open up to questions if anybody's got any. Yeah, go for it.
Yep. I think that mic is on, so we're totally deaf. So. Yeah.
Because the 3DO was priced at what, $700?
$699, I think.
Yeah.
In like '93.
I feel like if they had marketed it with the Pluto, if they had marketed it in terms of the capabilities of the network and stuff, do you think that they would have been able to make the price work since it's cheaper than like a 3DO or something, but it's still more expensive than the average console at the time?
Right. So I mean, that's we can speculate on that all day long. It's possible. At least with the 3DO, it was trying to present stuff that people understood. Like, hey, you like VCRs at home? You know how you like movies? Well, we have our own movie format that goes with this because the 3DO had VCD capabilities and so on and so forth. Presenting the internet to the average gamer in 1996, you got to remember there were movies coming out back then where nobody knew what the internet was, and like we thought, oh, the internet is like where you go into a computer.
Oh, I've seen Tron before.
Yeah, exactly. You go into Tron. You go into like, what's that movie Disclosure where they're like inside this like VR like system because I sent an email. That means I go into the computer. Like people just didn't know enough back then that I don't think you could pitch it now as Xbox Game Pass and you all know what I'm talking about. Imagine presenting that concept to somebody in '96. They're like, what are you talking about?
What I don't own my game.
Yeah. Well, how does that work? What do you mean I have to pay $500 and I don't get a game? Like it's we can speculate that maybe, but I think it would have required too much education to the audience before you could get to that point.
And Sega, if you were a fan of Sega back in the 90s, it was really death by 1,000 cuts at this point.
Yeah.
With how many hardware add-ons, revisions, systems were in really like a 5-year period.
I forget. 94 is by far the craziest year in the history of Sega. They released the 32X, the Saturn. They released Nomad. The Pico. Like all of these came out in 1 year, and there's even more to it. Their arcade hardware was all. I have a whole list.
This
somewhere.
was in development.
This was in development. 94 is the most psychotic, insane year for Sega, and this was 2 years after. If you were a Sega kid back then, you had no idea what you were supposed to buy. Anyway, sorry.
Thank you for the question.
Hey guys.
Yo.
So I just wanted to first point out how fitting it was that you guys were talking about all these planetary prototype named Sega
right?
consoles inside a literal planetarium.
Yeah, let's thank Joe for that one. Yeah.
So with the Pluto kind of being ahead of its time in a lot of ways with all this online stuff, did any of the development or any ideas that went into the Pluto at all influence the Dreamcast? Because that was also very online and ahead of its time in many ways.
Built-in modem.
Yeah, we got to assume that as much. People forget there is actually a modem for the Saturn, the Netlink.
Yeah.
Now, the funny thing is the Netlink actually came out a year after this. So the Netlink actually works on this thing, believe it or not. We have to assume that's probably true, but I don't work there. I would assume that it did. The actual hardware revision, though, from differences, there's not much else that's different about it from a Saturn. Ben Heck discovered extra RAM in it that doesn't seem to be doing anything. But beyond that, we're not really sure. It's got some oddities, like if you plug the Knights 3D controller into the system and turn it on, it won't boot up. We don't know why. The memory card slot works, so you can put a standard memory card in there. But if you put in the Action Replay to try and do imports or whatever, it won't turn on. We don't know why. So
the expansion port does work because if you do come to Adam's table and play it, we're running a satiator, which
you're talking about the VCD slot.
The VCD expansion
right.
slot.
So the actual 2 expansion slots are weird because Ben Heck, again, took these apart and he's like, there's something not right about the power supply. He's like, it's supplying enough power to get them to kind of turn on, but not enough to actually do what they're supposed to do. Again, prototype. So the one that came out in Japan, we have never had access to it. We assume that one probably completely functions, but again, we don't know. But to answer your question more specifically, the modem has to be the one thing we think they might have carried over. But it's kind of incorrect to look at this thing and say this is the cousin between the Saturn and the Dreamcast. I would think it's more like the PS4 Pro if the PS4 Pro only had one difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One last thing. To your knowledge, did the Dreamcast have any planet code name or
No,
anything?
it was called
that?
Katana.
Katana.
It ran out of planets.
Okay. Yeah.
That was pretty much what happened with that.
Yep.
This is the asteroid belt. I don't know what else you call it.
At least they didn't have a weird fixation with cats for a while.
Yeah, that was Atari's problem. Lynxes and Jaguars and all that.
Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Did they ever have plans to make the Saturn at any point compatible with the Genesis?
Yes.
Genesis?
Yes. So the reason the memory card slot is so ridiculously big is the Americans were extremely insistent that this thing be backwards compatible with Genesis. And as we said before, the relationship with those two was really bad, and the Japanese, out of spite, changed it just enough that it couldn't. And so there are actually photos online. You can see very early Saturn prototypes where it has a Genesis backwards compatibility. But you got to remember, in Japan, that was a negative because the Mega Drive was a huge flop there. So it would have looked like, why are we caring about backwards compatibility with something that failed?
And if it did play Genesis games, once again, brand confusion because Sega, a million hardware revisions was the little Sega CD Genesis combo.
The CDX?
CDX. So it would have just kind of looked like a CDX. It's like, oh, it's got a CD. Does it play Sega CD? No. Well, it plays Genesis.
Why doesn't it play the Sega CD?
Yeah.
That was Sega's problem is they did too much too quickly, and the audience didn't have time to catch up. I mean, we all look back and yeah, it'd be really cool if it had Genesis compatibility, but I can kind of see why they didn't do it. But while that helped them in Japan, because contrary to popular belief, the Saturn was not a flop there. It actually was a huge hit.
Outsold the N64.
Yeah, it
there.
actually performed amazing there. The Japanese were right in their own market. They're like, it would do a lot better if it had nothing to do with the Mega Drive. But the fact that they forced the Americans not to allow it to have all the things that would have been successful in North America really hurt it.
Interestingly, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that early in the Dreamcast developments, there was talk about, especially interest from Japan,
Yes,
of having Saturn backwards
in
compatibility.
Japan, they were toying with the idea of backwards compatibility of the Saturn into the Dreamcast. And the Americans that time overrid the Japanese and said, like,
Nobody bought this
nobody
thing."
bought this. And it would just increase the price by a minimum of $100, which then there was some talk of, like, well, how about the Japanese ones have it and the American ones don't? And they're like, you're just making the same mistakes again. You have to have a uniform system. The Dreamcast is the first system Sega did where they actually agreed on the strategy in all the major regions. Like, every system they ever did, they're like, that one will only come out in Japan, that one will only come out in Brazil, that one will only come out in Europe. It was like, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the NES. Yeah, how many of you actually know what the Sega Master System is? A couple? Okay, all right. Do you know in Europe, nobody had an NES? Everybody bought Sega Master Systems. You mentioned NES over there, they're like, oh, right, that was a thing. Just like the way we kind of look at the Sega Master System.
And forget about Brazil.
Yeah.
I mean, they still play the Master
have the Master System. So where their countries, like which country where which system was relevant was always different. That's why they just kind of had to do a complete refresh with the Dreamcast. So
Too little, too late.
yeah, unfortunately. Although Pico was a blast everywhere.
Did you have your hand up?
We can hear you, dude.
Yeah,
Go
no,
for
it's
it. We'll
good.
just repeat your question. You're good.
Yeah.
Wasn't that like an upgrade, like the potential next system or the one between the Jaguar and...
the 32-bit.
So I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know what you're talking about. There was an attempt, because like basically Atari sat out the 4th gen. So their 5th gen attempt was the Jaguar. Their last system before that was the 7800, which was a 3rd gen. They didn't make a...
links.
I'm not counting the links. It's a hand.
Always count the links.
Fine, links. Great. But their 4th gen system, they didn't have a home console 4th gen. I believe that's what you're referring to as the Panther. And by then they were kind of like, no. And then they had the Jaguar enough in development that that's just what they eventually pushed to. I would say correct decision, but we also know it turned into dental equipment, so it's hard to really say. Go for it. $550. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what they did with the Dreamcast eventually. Like, you would get a Dreamcast if you subscribed to...
Yeah, that was just them trying to push units at that point,
Yeah,
though.
they were desperate.
I mean,
yeah.
we don't know that, but, like, I mean, I guess it's a possibility. But, again, you have to remember how little the audience probably would have understood what they were subscribing to.
Yeah.
Because, again, this is the same era where people thought you sent an email, it meant you went into a computer. Like, there just wasn't enough of an educated base to know that.
And
So, I don't know.
I mean, to reference... and once again, like, if you have not read these emails that we did, that Sega,
Yeah,
that we did,
to it.
we leaked them
We
personally.
did it personally.
The leaked Sega emails from the mid '90s. One of the things that when they're talking specifically about the Pluto is with internet service providers.
Yes.
They're like, oh, so we have CompuServe. Maybe we could partner with them.
CompuServe, Net Zero, I forget the whole list, but they
Yeah.
had a whole bunch of companies I don't even think exist anymore. That were
So-
all like, yeah, we'll create an OS for it. We'll do all sorts of stuff.
So one of the things that Sega would do back in the '90s, especially, was they would partner with other companies like JVC or other things, Hitachi, in order to kind of like push their systems in different ways. So I could have foreseen maybe like, oh, if they partnered with one of these internet service providers in the '90s, that maybe they would have like, oh, if you subscribe to our internet service, you'll get a Pluto and like a free month of their Sega channel.
It's not an unheard of concept. Is anybody here familiar with the Canadian Blue Bell Xbox? No? Okay. So Canadians. So they did a really weird. Anybody remember Bell Telephone? Is anybody that old? So fun fact, do you know they're still around in Canada? Yeah, they're still around doing phone service up there. So I did a video on it. I don't remember all of this exactly, but I think it was like 2004. Bell of Canada did a promotion for 2 weeks. If you went into one of their physical stores, subscribed to their internet package, you would then have the option to buy a blue Xbox for like $400 on top of the package. It makes it one of the rarest Xbox versions that exists. I have one. I did the video, like I said.
Giant nerd.
Giant nerd. But point is, what you're suggesting is not impossible, but it's possible the Pluto could have come out in some random store in some random country for 2 weeks, and it'd be like, why? Now I gotta find that? That's annoying. Like, Saturn in particular did a lot of weird stuff. Like, anybody familiar with the Japanese Hitachi High Saturn? All right, we got
There's
one.
a nerd up
right
there.
There,
Yeah.
nerds, I love you. The Hitachi High Saturn in 1996, Hitachi and Sega, it's all 96, they get together and they're like, how about we do a system that's designed for your car and has an extra screen on it and is a functional GPS in 96. They made 1,000 of these things and only 500 monitors. That's it. And you couldn't order the monitor unless you could prove you owned the console and a car that's compatible, making it one of the most ridiculous things to try and find.
Sunshine, do you have one of those?
No,
I do.
Giant nerd.
I found it in a junk bin last year.
He doesn't. You don't own a car, Marty, yet, though.
Yeah, you got to work on the car, Marty, you jerk. But point is, he's right. There are some weird systems where companies partner with other systems, and you just don't know how this thing ever got made. Oh, it's my travel channel's coming up, I guess. Oh no, it's back to okay. I don't know what's going on with these guys, these homeless dudes. But yeah, there's, like I said, a lot of weird stuff out there. And go for it. Not offhand. They were all Japanese cars. It was only sold in Japan. You had, I think, if I remember the story correctly, you had to buy a certain type of car, and then you were allowed the right to buy the console. And then if you bought the console, yes, and then you were allowed the rights to buy the monitor. As a result, I only know like 2 people on this planet that have the monitor, and like 4 people that have the system, and I'm one of them. It's such a bizarre piece of tech. I might just start bringing it to stuff because it's just as weird. But like, at least it was sold technically.
If you get lost, I mean, it's a
Oh yeah, it's
a
very
handy-
useful. Well, that's the dumb thing is it needed proprietary GPS software, which I don't have. Although I have a buddy, oddly enough, who has 2 copies of it. Oh, that's been dumped. It's useless without that actual system. So all right, I'll tell you a weird story about a random disc I found once. Has anyone, again, I don't know why we're talking so much about the Saturn, but whatever we are. Has anybody ever heard of the rarest Saturn release called Oregon and Basic? Yeah, I don't expect any of you to know that. That's right. I beat you. Oregon and Basic is possibly the most bizarre story I've ever heard about a physical edition of a game, quote unquote. There was a house in Oregon being sold by a realtor, as happens. And this realtor thought, I want to market this house specifically to Japanese people. Don't know why. But he's like, I'm going to do a virtual tour of this house and make a Sega Saturn edition of it. He got Sega to publish a disc, only did 20 copies of it. That's it. It was never sold. It was literally like, oh, are you interested in this house? I will give you this disc, because that's how stupid popular the Saturn was in Japan. There was a good chance, hey, I'm interested in buying a house. Of course I have a Saturn. Yes, I'll check it out.
Was it VCD compatible?
No, it was just a Saturn format disc. It's so rare, it's never been dumped. Now, last year, I'm walking into a store in Japan called Hard Off, which is a hilarious name. Everybody loves to laugh at it, but it just means hardware. And so I'm looking at stuff, and behind this glass case, I see a Sega Saturn release for $1,000, and I'm like, okay, that's a lot, especially in Japan for any one game. What is this? And I have no clue. So I take a photo of it. I go into the Saturn community. I'm like, what is this? They lose their minds because no one's ever seen one. And they were like, yeah, that's the thing. They tell me the whole story. And this guy's like, I will give you the money for that right now. And I was like, okay. So I got all the airline miles, good for me. And then he just pays me the money back. So I bought this disc, and I brought it back. And I'm like, dude, I have this disc with the Pluto, with the Hitachi High Saturn, with the, I'm like, this is an insane combination. I took a nice little photo just to share that. But it's like, there is some really, truly weird stuff out there where you just don't know how any of that gets published. Like, why would Sega be like, yeah, you can produce just 20 copies of a weird virtual tour? But then they were like, we're in the business of selling discs. What do you want? You're like, you paid us, we'll give you the discs. So there's apparently 2 known copies of that disc. One is in the possession of the guy I just sent it to, and the other one is some guy who's like, no, it's mine, I won't dump it. So I ripped it before I sent it, so it's archived, but there's weird stuff out there.
I think we have about 5 minutes left. Any more questions?
We were talking about the weird releases. Wasn't there like a version of the Mega Drive in
Oh, the Mega Jet.
The Mega Jet. It's
Go ahead.
it's basically a Sega Nomad without a screen. In fact, when they were developing the Nomad, they ended up like repurposing a lot of the tech from that system and just added a screen and to
Yeah,
it.
there's two versions of it. There was one that was eventually sold in very limited retail. I want to say just to like Kojima Camera, which is like I think like Walmart type of brand that they just exist over there. Sold exclusively in their stores. The first iteration of it though was only in conjunction with Japan Airlines, so you couldn't actually buy it. You had to be a child who wanted to just play it on the plane. That particular version is essentially impossible to acquire, but it's also, the only difference is it has a proprietary power supply, because back then every plane was like, no, we need our own special like outlet, so that was the deal with that. And the logic behind it was, oh, if we have a kid on a plane who likes this, maybe he'll go home and buy a Mega Drive after he's played it. But that was it. That was as far as they thought. It was a complete disaster as far as like its sale.
Another failed piece of Sega
Yeah,
hardware.
I'd love to have one, but I've seen it a couple times, but it's always like thousands of dollars. I'm like, I don't care that much for a portable Genesis you can't play because it doesn't have a screen. So, yeah, go for it.
Oh, there's a couple.
Yeah, these just showed up. I mean, nobody's ever walked up to me like, here, I have the lost Sega Jupiter. Like, no, it's never quite happened that way. People do bring rare stuff that occasionally they want you to scope out, but it's usually like, I'm just going to be honest, it's usually like, quote unquote, common rare. Like, look, I have Panzer Dragoon Saga. I'm like, so do I. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's hard to compete with that. I mean, 2 of these were ever made. 4 of those were ever made. It's really hard to find that level of odd stuff, and to be honest, most people are smarter than us. They don't bring their rare odd things to a public forum. We're different because we're stupid, so we did it. But like, whatever.
But I mean, like the moral of the story, especially from this and the PlayStation, is that don't sleep on like going out and doing some video game archaeology yourself, because we would have never found this if he didn't go to a junk sale. Terry Diebold, would have never found the PlayStation if he didn't go to this estate sale.
Yeah.
So go out there and look, because you might find something like you mentioned that Sega video where they were going through the prototype consoles and talking
They
about
found a Venus in their own archives. Like, oh, I forgot we made this.
yeah, it's and that's like the first time the thing has ever been seen.
Yeah, 'cause
we
they
didn't
never
know it
looked.
existed until a year ago. So you never know. There's stuff out there.
I think you got the one question right there, buddy.
Has there ever been a standalone Logitech N64, or were they always built into the TV in the system, like in the building?
that I've never seen or heard of.
Are you
a
talking about that
standalone.
one that's in the museum?
It was sold to hotels. You would
Yeah.
pay, like, exorbitant
Right.
rates,
I think they actually have one here in the museum over there.
Oh, they do.
I think.
Yeah.
I think.
Because I know it's always in the TV, but I think the hotels.
Right, yeah.
At that time.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. There's.
Early, like phone cable wire, but there was no console. I was like, is it in the TV? Is it like
I think it's like just wired through, and there was like a brain somewhere. I think they actually
it's like
have one in the museum over there, along with Super Nintendos. Are we over time? I think there is a physical box, and like I said, I think there's one in the museum over there. We can do one more question. Who's got a really good one? Let's go out with
All the way in the
I
back.
saw you up at the top, dude. Go for it. We're trusting you.
How did you like the console?
Which ones? All of them? They're all awesome.
He cuddles with this one. You
I
can see
do.
pictures of it.
I've hugged it. I've kissed it. I've licked it. I'm sorry. I'm cradling it like children. It is my child I have to give back to its father at some point. So, thank you very much, everybody,
Thank you so
for
much,
joining
guys.
us. It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And again, this will all be on display out there if you guys want to see it up front.
Yeah, come talk. Come play the
Talk.
Pluto.
We're all for it.
Exactly.